once again how happy I am to have the wonderful CB6 staff that we do that has like navigated this difficult time like without missing a beat. So yes, Claire. Yeah.
Hear ye, hear ye.
Hey, thank you.
I will say as a manager, having Brendan and Cody, such great staff members, makes my job so much easier. So it makes all the difference. So they deserve all the praise.
Okay. All right, we're now live streaming. Welcome to the July 6, 2020 meeting of the CB6 Transportation Committee. My name is Sandy McKee and I am chair of the committee. This meeting is called to order at 7:02, and tonight we are joined by District Manager Jesus Perez and Community Associate Brendan Berth. Members of the public, you can raise any question or comments that you have through the Q&A feature of Zoom. If there is any time following, sorry, my screen just jumped on me. If there is any time following the committee's discussion, we will field questions from the public. No one has volunteered to take minutes for tonight's meeting. May we please have a volunteer? If you can volunteer to take the minutes, please raise your hand through Zoom. And I'm sorry, do we have someone?
Not all at once now, not all at once. No one so far. Oh, Phil.
Well, Phil took them last month. Let's
I'm happy
share the wealth.
Uh-huh.
Joan, it's an inaugural minute taking. Would you be interested? No.
I would be happy to do it, except I don't know who is here.
Oh,
Yeah,
We'll give you all that information.
Yeah, the CB6 office will share that information as well as a as well as a guide on how to format the minutes. So the office will take care of that.
Oh, okay.
And we actually have
To do it.
YouTube. Thank you, Joan. That's wonderful. Okay. We will now take attendance by roll call. Jesus will conduct the roll call.
All right, everyone. I will call your name and you will unmute yourselves. When your name is called, please say present. I will announce if there is a quorum. Sandy McKee.
Present.
Jean Santoro. Jean Santoro. All right. Joan Barenbaum.
Here.
Thank you. Claire Brennan.
Here.
Thank you. B. Disman.
Here, thank you.
Thank you. Andrew Gross.
Present.
Thank you. Molly Hollister.
Here.
Thank you. Yusuf Khalid.
Here.
Thank you. Phil Napolitano.
Here.
Thank you. Matt Roberts.
Present.
Thank you. Larry Shire. Larry Shire. Ann Seligman.
here.
Thank you. Brian Van Nieuwenhoven.
Present.
Thank you. Ronnie White. Ronnie White. Bob Cohen. Do we know if Bob called in? Okay.
Doesn't look like it.
All right. James Wilson. James Wilson.
Larry did just get here though.
Okay. Ray Knowles. Ray Knowles. All right. We do have a quorum.
Okay. The agenda for tonight's meeting was distributed ahead of time by the board office and appears on the screen before you. If there is no objection, we will adopt the agenda as stated. Members of the committee, if you object to adopting the agenda, you may raise your hand through Zoom. Seeing no objections, the agenda for tonight's meeting is adopted. The minutes from the June 1st meeting and the June 10th meeting were distributed ahead of time by the board office. If there is no objection, we will adopt these two sets of minutes. Committee members, if you object to adopting both sets of minutes, you may raise your hand through Zoom. And just a note, we will make minor modifications to correct grammar and any punctuation as part of the process of finalizing the minutes. Seeing no objections, the minutes from June 1st and June 10th meetings are adopted. They will be available on the CB6 website. In order to conduct an efficient meeting, we have to set a few ground rules. No one may speak until granted the floor. Committee members, if you have a question about committee business or wish to make a motion, please raise your hand through Zoom. If you click the participants panel will appear and you can find the raise the hand function there. If you still have technical difficulty, you can click the chat icon and relay your difficulty. Just a note, the chat icon should not be used for committee business or questions about agenda topics. Any remarks that you have should be made for the record by raising your hand through Zoom. Chat should only be used for technical difficulties or writing an email address that you want to transmit to the entire group. When a committee member is given the floor to speak, I will identify you and you can unmute yourself so that you can speak. We are required by executive order to create a verbatim transcript of the meeting, so please keep your questions and comments succinct and germane to the discussion. Our first item on tonight's agenda is a presentation from the New York City Department of Transportation on protected bike lanes for 38th and 39th Street. And I'm not sure who is making the presentation this evening.
I can introduce, this is Kimberly, Director of Special Projects at the Manhattan Borough Commissioner's Office. Tonight we do have two presentations. This is the first one, both of which are building on some of the temporary protected bike lanes that we've put in, as well as our years of work to implement crosstown protected bike lanes in Midtown on a series of streets, including 12th and 13th, 26th and 29th, and 52 and 55. And then we'll talk about 2nd Avenue after, building on all of the work that we've done there as well. So we have a number of folks here from our bike team tonight, and I believe that Olguin is going to kick off with the 38th, 39th presentation.
Great, thank you. And we'll go through the full presentation, and then if there are any questions, we will take them from the committee members first. And if we do have time, we can take questions from the rest of the attendees.
So again, hello, my name is Olguin and I'll be covering Midtown crosstown protected bike lanes for tonight. To start off with a brief overview of what we'll be covering in tonight's presentation, we'll first be covering some background on previous crosstown bike lanes to give context for our proposal. And then we'll dive into our process for selecting the routes and some of the details of how it would work within the given context. And so this is something that Kim just briefly touched on, but the map shown here shows the previous crosstown routes to demonstrate the ongoing comprehensive plan for protected crosstown bike lanes in Midtown. This effort began in 2018 and includes routes spaced every half mile apart through Midtown from Union Square to Central Park. Starting in 2018, we installed lanes on 26th and 29th, 12th and 13th, and most recently on 52nd and 55th Street, which are shown here on green. Tonight, we'll be discussing our proposal for 38th and 39th Street. And these projects all build on the ongoing conversations and feedback we've received from the Community Board and CB 5 and 4. Additionally, they work towards a goal of installing new crosstown protected bike lanes to close the gaps in the network, upgrade existing bike lanes to provide better access to destinations, transit, and greenways, while still accommodating traffic and loading in their design. Lastly, we plan to have a similar process to previous crosstowns and looking to the board to work with us on perfecting the design to meet many of the different land uses and stakeholder concerns that may come up. In terms of outcomes following the installation of lanes in the 50s and 20s, we found that installation resulted in an increase of cyclists using the lanes along these corridors. Vehicle travel times were also not adversely affected by the redesign of the corridors, and the updates to the curbside regulations were effective and well used. The design elements in these projects were generally found to be both replicable and flexible for use in Midtown. And so following the implementation of 52 and 55, DOT street ambassadors work to distribute educational materials and engage with delivery cyclists on new infrastructure and rules of the road. During this outreach process and throughout the implementation, we also conducted a number of walkthroughs and on-site meetings with various stakeholders in response to their concerns. These adjustments address some of the feedback we received from the board and include fine-tuning the hotel loading zone markings to accommodate guest activity and changes to signage. We plan to continue to work with the board as partners on these projects moving forward, and we plan to return to complete installation of markings and vertical elements at locations that have ongoing construction. And so moving on to route selection. First, I'll review the existing conditions of the proposed project area, the selection process, and the details of our design. So the area surrounding our proposal includes Midtown between 35th Street and 42nd Street. And so for context, the area includes high volume destinations such as Times Square, Bryant Park, Javits Center, and a dense commercial district. And in relation to the bicycle network, there's generally a lack of protected bicycle lanes, which makes it difficult to access many of the various destinations that are identified on this map. As you can see by this map, the green lines are the protected routes, and the blue and pink identify the conventional and shared lane. These are in some areas, but generally there's a lack of continuous and connected infrastructure in Midtown. The streets in this area differ a bit from the previous crosstown in the 50s and the 20s. Some new considerations include wider roadways with multiple travel lanes. And in our observations, we found that there is excess capacity during the off-peak. The 10-foot travel lanes include shared bike lanes in some areas, which make them narrow for simultaneous travel. In general, the street could be better organized with the inclusion of updated loading regulations to increase turnover and the creation of dedicated space for cyclists where there is currently very little infrastructure. And so both of these photos shown here really show the condition that's not a comfortable condition for cyclists traveling along the corridor in the most congested conditions. In terms of our route selection process, we considered the area between 42nd and 34th Street to be optimal for maintaining the half-mile distance from the previously installed crosstown routes. And similarly to the previous crosstown routes, we looked at continuity and connectivity as the greatest determining factors for our route selection. But for this area of Midtown and for this project, there were some additional challenges in the street network that were taken into consideration in our planning process. Also, in terms of connectivity, there weren't many streets in this area that connect from the Hudson to the East River. And so we prioritized streets that connect across town to the First Avenue bike lane. Looking at the eastbound streets in this area, 38th Street really stands out as one of the most viable eastbound routes between 11th Avenue and First Avenue. Just to call out one of the many issues with the neighboring streets, 40th Street crosses the Lincoln Tunnel entrance and a major Port Authority exit, and we see similar difficult network conditions on the other neighboring routes. In the westbound direction, 39th Street similarly stands out as the best option, as many of the neighboring routes overlap with tunnel entrances or are discontinuous or have two-way conditions that are not ideal for our proposed design. And so moving into some details of our presentation and our proposal, the previous crosstown protected bike lanes featured two designs that are shown here. Delineator protected with curbside buffered bike lanes and parking protected lanes similar to what we've seen on the previous crosstowns like 26th and 29th, 52, 55. Our proposal for 38th and 39th Street will use very similar treatments, but incorporate rush hour lanes to accommodate the higher vehicle volumes seen here during the peak traffic conditions. 38th and 39th Street can be broken down by three distinct neighborhoods with different characteristics. On the west side within CB4, we have the Lincoln Tunnel, access and mostly one travel lane with 2 parking lanes. In the conventional core within CB5, the streets generally have 2 travel and 2 parking lanes. And lastly, on the east side of CB6, which we'll be discussing tonight, the blocks are very irregular and have multiple travel lanes and rush hour lanes. And so these regular blocks are what we'll be focusing on for tonight's presentation. On a related note, in response to COVID and the need to develop transportation options as the city reopens, we've been installing temporary bicycle routes throughout the city. Last month, we began the installation of barrels and signage to provide space for cyclists on 38th and 39th, west of Madison Avenue. And 38th and 39th Street had 2 travel lanes and 2 parking lanes. And as part of the temporary design, we shifted the parking lane into the second moving lane, which is shown here in this cross section. And this provides space for the temporary lane and barrels. And we've been monitoring these lanes daily, with some of our staff going out to shift these back into place, hang additional signage, and speak to business owners and drivers along the corridor. And so we're reaching the halfway point of the presentation and really moving into some of the details of our design. The core proposed design for 38th and 39th Street and between 8th Avenue and Madison is very similar to the previous crosstowns, which I've mentioned, in that it provides a parking protected bike lane along both streets. However, it will differ from the temporary design. But the thing to focus on here is that this is really identifying the CB5 section. And this design is flexible in that it provides a dedicated space for cyclists, but still allows for the 2 lanes of traffic for the high vehicle volume during the day. And it maintains overnight and off-peak loading and parking. So the curbside lane is also a far more comfortable condition for cyclists who use the existing shared routes at this location. And the described treatment will also be seen in some of the areas we'll be discussing east of Madison Avenue. While the blocks here are very consistent, the blocks on CB4 are irregular, and so we'll be going through several cross sections as we cover this area. First off, moving further east on 38th Street, the design varies where the width changes, and between Madison and Park Avenue, the bike path would be curbside, but buffer protected between the moving lanes. And it would also include the removal of the loading space along the north curb next to the bike path. And we would incorporate a rush hour lane along the opposite curb. And that would allow us to maintain parking during the off-peak and overnight loading. Between Park Avenue and 3rd and Tunnel Exit Street to 3rd to 2nd Avenue, the conditions are very similar, with additional roadway width providing clearance for flexible delineators within some of that buffered area. This would also involve the removal of spaces along the north curb to maintain parking during the off-peak and overnight. Between 3rd Avenue and Tunnel Exit Street, the existing conditions change again slightly. Currently, there's 1 vehicle lane and 2 curbside parking lane along the stretch. And so in this case, we would maintain the existing conditions, but standardize the parking lane width to provide space for a curbside parking protected bike lane. This is very similar to what we've seen on 26th and 29th, and would involve the removal of parking along the north curb for intersection treatments, regulation changes, and better sight lines for greater visibility for vehicles interacting with cyclists and pedestrians in this area. On 38th Street, between 2nd Avenue to Tunnel Approach Street, there's an existing shared lane and existing rush hour lanes. Our proposal would provide dedicated space for cyclists along the north curb, while by reallocating some of that space along the southernmost rush hour lane and maintain 2 full-time travel lanes and overnight parking. Lastly, for that last block of 38th Street between the tunnel and 1st Avenue, we would upgrade the existing shared lane at this location to a parking protected curbside lane and establish a rush hour lane along the south curb. This would maintain some of the existing hospital drop-off areas here and provide a connection to the East River Greenway with the existing 2-way path on 1st Avenue. Now moving on to 39th Street in the westbound direction. Between 1st Avenue and Tunnel Approach Street, we would upgrade the existing standard bike lane that we see here to provide a curbside bike lane with flexible delineators. And this would involve the removal of loading spaces along the south curb, but maintain the opposite parking lane. Similarly, between Tunnel Approach and 2nd Avenue, we would upgrade the existing bike lane to establish a curbside delineator protected bike lane in the existing park lane. The northern rush hour lane would also be maintained. On 39th Street, between 2nd Avenue to the tunnel exit, the bike lane becomes shared at this location, and during congested condition creates that uncomfortable condition for cyclists, similar to what you see in this photo. And so to provide the dedicated space for cyclists along the south curb, we would again eliminate the northern parking lane and provide a curbside rush hour lane to really make room for that delineator protected bike lane. Lastly, on this atypical block of 39th Street, we would be upgrading the existing shared lane. One second, wrong way. We would be upgrading the existing shared lane to delineator protected along the south curb. Something to note at this location is that there are a number of hotel loading zones to be accommodated on these blocks. And so the design differs from the shown cross-section between Lexington and Park Avenue in that the parking switches to the north curb and is maintained along the south curb near the hotel loading zones. And so finishing up with just 5 more slides. Next, we'll touch on some of the details for making this design work. And so curb management. On past crosstown projects, we've successfully employed curb management strategies to accommodate the many different land uses seen in Midtown. This included updating the parking regulations to increase turnover and discourage double parking that we commonly see here. We also maintain emergency access on some of the narrow conditions with our no standing zones. And as a release, and these really function as a release valve for traffic in critical conditions. And part of our curb management also involved working with hotels, businesses, and theaters to really accommodate their pickups and drop-offs with dedicated loading zones. There are a number of design elements that we also include in our design of the crosstown lanes that really work to improve efficiency of vehicle flow and safety for pedestrians and cyclists. This includes split phases, and which are a signal timing tool that provide a separate signal phase for vehicles, cyclists, and pedestrians. And this improves safety by mitigating conflict at those intersections. At intersections with lower turn volumes, where we're not able to install a split phase or other turn treatments, we install offset crossings. And these really calm turning vehicles, interacting with cyclists and pedestrians, and clear up sight lines at the intersection. Lastly, the new right turn bays at select locations also increase vehicle capacity and pulls turning vehicles away from the path of through traffic and really alleviate some of that back pressure that comes from like turning vehicles. And this improves safety by eliminating the back pressure and slowing vehicles as they're turning across pedestrians and cyclists, and generally creates less delay for vehicles at intersections. To touch on the previously mentioned offset crossings and the turn treatments, cyclist safety is improved by this design by separating cyclists from through traffic with the use of quick curb or vehicle free signal timing phases like LPIs and split phases, which I've mentioned before. And pedestrian safety also benefits greatly from this design through the use of just simplified turning movements. To touch on next steps, tonight we discussed the segments of 38th and 39th Street, which fall within the boundaries of CB6. However, we also wanted to briefly touch on the typical design for the western segments of the proposals. On the CB4 side, the design would be parking protected with a single travel lane. In CB5, where the densest commercial activity occurs and the street width is a little bit more generous, the design is more typical with parking protected bike lanes. And rush hour lanes, which maintain the 2 travel lanes during those peak conditions. And the design varies the most in CB6, which we've covered tonight, with delineator protected bike lanes, curbside bike lane, and even some rush hour treatments in some of those select locations. Again, for next steps, lastly, we would like to move as soon as early summer or early fall with installing these lanes permanently in response to the demand that we've seen from the temporary lanes. But we would continue to engage with stakeholders and the neighboring CBs. Thank you. And I guess I'll open up to any questions.
Thank you very much. And so just a reminder, we do take questions from the committee members first, and then if we have time, we do take them from the public. I did have I had a couple questions myself, if you don't mind. I wondered why on 38th Street, you're shifting to the north side of the street, where currently it's on the south. The bike infrastructure is on the south side.
Are you referring to the shared
Yes, the
infrastructure?
Sharrows are on the south side of the street.
Okay, generally, so we've designed the protected bike lane to go with the flow of traffic, and also take advantage of the parking lane on the existing side of traffic. Currently, we wanted to maintain the rush hour lane on the opposite curb.
So people going down First Avenue to get to the Greenway will have to cross the traffic.
Currently, there's a two-way section of First Avenue on that last block of 38th Street. And so cyclists would be able to turn at this location to make that connection to the Greenway.
Right now, I mean, it's just they have to cross the street to do it. I'm just wondering, but
Yeah.
that would be on the north side throughout the full district.
It would be on the north side, but something that we're looking at on First Avenue is turn treatment to make that connection a little bit safer.
Okay, thank you. And I guess we should ask how many parking spaces will be reduced?
It differs by block, but we've also included a breakdown of the parking loss numbers at each location.
It seems fantastic. It's not a problem, I don't think, in this district, in this area. So I'll open it up to questions. Larry, you had a question? Your hand is raised.
Okay, I'm unmuted. I had some questions to try to get a better understanding of what's going to happen. As Sandy, your question at 38th Street and First Avenue, as I understand it, that means that you're going to have to wait through a phase of the light in order to go down to 37th Street via First Avenue?
Yes.
Okay. At 39th Street and 2nd Avenue on the southeast corner, there's currently a city bike station, which you depicted in one of the photographs. Where will that be moving?
So generally, we would look to relocate some of those city bike stations onto the avenues, but this is something that we're still discussing with Bike Share, and we don't yet have a location, but that's something we're coordinating on.
Okay, because that's a very important bike share station, because I use it to go to the NYU Rusk Institute building at 38th and 2nd. So there are many users there, both doctors and patients, for whom keeping that station nearby would be helpful.
Yes. We'll take that into mind.
Okay, and then one other thing that you showed was hotel zones. And I was not clear, maybe you could just go over that quickly again, where the bikes are going along in a protected lane. Would there be a situation where there would be a conflict between cyclists and people moving luggage who may not be paying attention?
So what we would employ at this location and what we've installed at previous hotel loading zones is really like a treatment specifically to warn cyclists as they're moving through the area. In past hotel loading zones that we've installed, we've also found that some of those stakeholders have even put out additional signage to really like slow cyclists through that area, but there would be like appropriate signage and clear markings on the street to indicate to cyclists that they're moving through an area where there's, hotel activity going on.
Yeah, hopefully it won't be forcing you to zigzag because some vehicles pull in straight to the curb and don't leave any room for the bicyclists.
Larry, this condition exists currently on
Yeah.
the 5th Street and 52nd bike lanes, and it seems to be working fairly well through our district anyway.
Okay, good, good. And then the last question concerns, not now in the middle of the summer, but when we get to the winter, I noticed the width of various segments of the bike lane plus the buffer zone are rather narrow. And I'm wondering how, if you don't have specialized snow plowing equipment, you intend to keep that bike lane clear.
Hi, I can jump in. This is Eileen with the bike unit also. We have a similar clearance on the other crosstown lanes. And what we usually do here is that they get swept and plowed during alternate side or in this location where the meter turns over. So these vehicles are moving each day. So there'll be a lot of opportunities to get in there and sweep without even needing the specialized equipment for the plowing here. If it is needed, we can look into that as well. But usually for these, it's worked out pretty well with the vehicles moving since it's parking protected.
Well, how does that work when you have a lot of snow and vehicles are not forced to be moved?
So in some of those scenarios, we have been able to use a much smaller sweeper that's available on a very limited basis. But what we have found, especially on these two streets, is that the vehicles are moving frequently because they're generally commercial meters or rush hour regulations where there's a lot of daily turnover. But we'll keep an eye on it. And as to the other lanes that have the delineators, those are with that clearance in mind, so plows could always get through.
Okay, thank you very much. That's it for me.
Thank you, Larry. Anne, you had your hand raised? Anne, sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry, I lost myself and couldn't find myself to unmute. First of all, I really want to thank you. This is a great presentation. It's very thorough. I really appreciate you answered a lot of my questions kind of as it went along. One question though that did remain is where the loading zone, where loading spaces have been removed. A couple of those slides seemed like there were like a lot of loading spaces. And I have concerns about that as well as like, okay, we can tell the cyclists, but we need to tell the tourists too, like the people staying at those hotels. I think we need to do some outreach to the hotels to make sure that they are educating people getting out of a taxi, that they're, you know, welcome to New York is not having an accident with the cyclist. But my question about the removal of not so much the parking spaces, but the loading spaces, do you have information on kind of the utilization rates of those? I think on one of those slides, there were 40 spaces being removed. Like that's a lot if they're, you know, being utilized at 70%.
Yes, so this is not something that we look at specifically on this location, like in this segment on CB4, but it is something that we looked at on the core section of the corridor that we use as guidance. And also in our observation, we found that this is something that would be feasible in this in these locations, considering from our vehicle volumes that we've collected, that we found that there are a lot less heavy traffic moving through this area.
And I would add to that too, that some of those large numbers that you saw were for locations that were like a design covering 3 different blocks combined.
Right, right. And I'm assuming that these numbers are not COVID numbers. These are pre-COVID numbers, because like anything you're learning now is
all of the data is
hopefully not what we will be living with in 2 years when this is being designed for the long term.
Yes, so all of this data was collected and analyzed prior to, you know, COVID
Awesome.
And all of this.
Thanks. Like I said, very excellent presentation.
And just to jump in on the hotel question, there was a number of hotels along the 52nd and 55th Street routes last year, and we worked with several of them, made several site visits to make adjustments and to make sure they understood how they were operating. So we're ready to engage with them extensively.
Okay, Andrew, you had a question?
Yeah, hi, Sandy, thanks. Can before I ask my question, can you go back to the slide that lists the amount of parking that's going to be removed? Because I think that was pretty quick. So it doesn't have a grand total here, but it looks like, I mean, just in CB6, just doing some quick math, unless you guys know the numbers, but it's like, and we're talking about what, like 80 spots or something, 90 spots just in CB6. And then if you add all these up, I assume we're talking about almost like, I can't do this math, like 400 or 500 parking spots or something. Is that?
It's not that high. For the entire project, it's closer to, it's actually under 200. And I would add too that I know that this is a lot of numbers on this slide. What we really wanted to share here is that although there is some removal, the vast majority of the spaces are remaining.
I just want to make my point, I guess. So let's just assuming then it's about 200 spots. I just, you know, every time that I think it's a great presentation, there's obviously a need for protected bike lanes. But, you know, I'm also thinking about every time there's a presentation, it always seems to begin with, let's remove parking spaces. And if I were to go back in time, since over the years I've been on this committee, there's probably been like hundreds and hundreds of parking spaces removed. And, you know, one of the things that COVID has shown us, you know, especially as winter is coming and there's a possibility of a resurgence of COVID, a lot of people don't feel comfortable taking public transportation. And there are people who are coming from outer boroughs that want to work, you know, in Manhattan that need to get here. And I have to say, I'm really concerned, and I'm not sure how I feel about supporting something that's going to take out another 200 parking spots for people that maybe are going to need to avoid taking buses or the subway into our district to work here. We're going to force them to take this, you know, public transit they don't want to take. And the bike lanes probably won't be used in the dead of winter when the pandemic hits again. So it seems to me that the timing is just a little skewed when maybe we want to let people park and drive and not force them into, you know, workers coming from Staten Island or wherever, make them use public garages that are private garages that are expensive. This is my main concern.
So I'm sure the bike team can add more to this, but a lot of the spaces that are here are not passenger vehicle parking spaces. Those kinds of car regulations are actually really not very common in Midtown, in the core of Midtown. So most of this is commercial loading, which is not to say that it's without impacts, but it's not necessarily impacting folks in the way that you're describing for the most part.
I mean, is there, just to understand, just so we have a number, do you guys know how many of those regular metered spots would be affected here?
So
I'm regular about those people that are going to be outer borough.
Sure,
I'll let Eileen speak to this. Sorry, I'm going to pipe in. Ted Wright here, I run the bike program. But I just want to reiterate that what Kim said is absolutely correct, that there aren't a lot of alternate side parking spaces in Midtown. My kid is talking to me, so Eileen, please elaborate if you know the ASP numbers.
Sure, and we'd be happy to share this in more detail afterwards, but these spaces are all either commercial meters or existing rush hour regulations. There are a few diplomat spaces for authorized vehicles only. And so we're working closely with our parking team to really see what we can adjust nearby to, you know, accommodate some of that loading that still needs to occur nearby. And we can also take a look if there are places where we could accommodate passenger meters, but those are not among the spaces that would be removed on this project.
Yeah, I mean, if
there's no alternate side regulations on these particular locations.
Even passenger meters wouldn't allow someone to come and drive in to park for the day to work. That's not something that is typically permitted on these kinds of crosstown streets in Midtown.
Okay, and Yusuf also had a question.
Yeah, thank you, Sandy. So 2 quick things. One is I often use the 52nd Street bike lane west to east, and oftentimes that corridor between 3rd Avenue and 2nd Avenue, because there's so much traditional commercial loading, ends up being blocked up typically like in the morning into the afternoon, even though there's a bike lane there. So I guess I'd love to understand What type of outreach is done with some of the larger tenants on those blocks with a lot of commercial loading? What type of enhanced enforcement is done early on when a new lane is constructed? Because I imagine the same thing's going to happen here, and it ends up, in fact, feeling more dangerous at times than anticipated.
Can you just say which blocks that was again that you said?
So the 52nd Street west to east bike lane, probably from 3rd Avenue to 2nd Avenue is one of the worst stretches. And again, it's all commercial loading. It's fairly large tenants, high rises, those sorts of things. So I don't know if there's a playbook that DOT utilizes in the, call it, early days or months of a new lane being developed in a super commercial heavy area. Just, I guess, drive compliance early on from some of the building owners and so on. Or whether it's just up to, I think, folks to report it as often as possible and wait to see what happens.
So I think it's a little bit of both. We do stakeholder engagement before we implement, and are sometimes able to hear from them about their particular needs and make design adjustments even before we implement. That sort of depends on where we know that there might be issues, or where people will give us the heads up that there may be issues. And then, of course, after the fact, we also can look at places where there are issues. If you're reporting, if you're seeing things, let us know, and we can see if there's a way to either tweak the regulations or communicate with the property owners.
Got it. Okay. So we'll check back in a couple months, I imagine. Thank you.
And thank you, Yusuf. And I'd just like to note that if any of the members of the public do have a question, if you can type it into the question and answer section, I will make sure it gets relayed on to the DOT. And I actually also ride the 52nd and 55th Street lanes. And unfortunately, a lot of this is blocked at night when people are doing construction and demolition trucks. And I know we rely on the NYPD and they don't seem to be following through at night, definitely. It is a problem. We did get one question from the public. Why not add flexible delineators to the bike lane between Madison and Park?
Or is that 38?
I'm not sure if that's 38th or 39.
Well, just to point out, on some, I might have gone through it a little bit too quickly, but on some of the segments where we have that 11-foot clearance, where we can have street sweeping coming through without an issue, we've included a flexible delineator, but the block widths do change quite a lot. And on some of the narrow sections, it's just not something that we could provide and still maintain, clean curb.
Another question, any chance of stronger delineators to prevent parking on the wider buffer zones? On 12th and 13th, those buffer zones are abused, especially at the corners where you really need the better sight lines.
So again, Mike's can add to this, but you want to start? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, we're looking at new materials right now. There are budgetary constraints, and it is something that we're very hot on. However, it is difficult to, with this project right now, we're just trying to get it in, and we will be filling in the gaps. I really actually appreciate the comments about 52 and 55, and we are going to monitor them, and we will be adding stuff as needed.
And we are still planning to add some additional delineators to 12th and 13th, recognizing that in some places they are fairly spread out and that they could be more effective if they're a little bit denser. So I believe that's still part of our plan.
And another question, please repeat the comment about a protected bike lane every half mile for crosstown. Is that meant to be as far down as the Battery?
And so just to go back all the way to the beginning, this was in reference to the previous crosstowns in terms of spacing, just within the limits between 55th Street to 12th Street. Those streets the pairs are just spaced a half mile between.
But you are planning on extending further south eventually?
Currently, there's no plans to extend any further south. This, I believe, would be the last pair that we would discuss.
Outside.
It's all
It's the
coming out of
last-
the Midtown Crosstown the bike lanes that we've been looking at for years. Of course, we're always looking at new projects, but as far as the work that was done here, this is the last pair that was identified 2 or 3 years ago.
And as I mentioned, it's outside our district, but I know it will be appreciated. Another question. These lanes would be more effective if the painted buffer zone were replaced with a raised pavement treatment. Does DOT have any plans for something like this on crosstown lanes?
I think Ted's answer to the last question.
Raised pavement is very expensive. It's something we're looking at, but at the same time, we are meeting concerns right now. I'm meeting some personal concerns about bedtime stories right now. But we are looking at it, and they are capital projects, which is kind of what you're talking about, where you actually have to change the drainage on the street. Gets extremely cost prohibitive. And I've always looked at as the first step, we want to get these lanes in. And as the city redoes streets, they do them ever so often, that hopefully we can add some of these things in full-on concrete.
Okay, thank you. And committee members, if we don't have any additional questions, might we be able to move forward with voting on this to support this proposal?
So moved.
Second.
All right, we will take roll call. All those, Jesus will do that for us. So I think he'll call your name, and if you could reply, unmute and reply.
All right, I'll call everybody's name. All right. You can vote in favor, against, abstain, or not entitled. Sandy McKee.
For.
Okay. Thank you. Jean Santoro. Jean Santoro.
Yes.
All right. Joan Berenbaum.
Yes.
Thank you. Claire Brennan.
I abstain for cause, but I just want to commend everyone who worked on this project for their efforts. And as a committee member, get rid of all the parking. Sorry.
Thank you. Beatrice Disman.
Yes.
Okay. Andrew Gross.
4.
Okay. Molly Hollister.
In favor.
Okay. Yusuf Khalid.
Support.
Okay, thank you. Phil Napolitano.
In favor, Jesus.
Thank you. Matt Roberts.
In favor.
Thank you. Larry Shire.
Or
Thank you. Ann Seligman.
I'm in favor, and unless anybody else is dying to, I'll offer to write the reso.
Okay. Thank you. Brian Van Nieuwenhoven.
In favor.
Thank you. Ronnie White. Ronnie White. Bob Cohen. Bob Cohen. James Wilson. James Wilson. Ray Knowles. Ray Knowles. All right, we've got 12 in favor, 1 abstention. The motion carries.
Okay, and then our next agenda item, and I'm sorry I don't have the agenda in front of me, but I believe is the 2nd Avenue protected bike lanes. And I'm not sure who from DOT will be doing that presentation.
I believe this one will be Nick Carey.
Thank you.
That's right.
We have
Hello,
a
everybody.
whole-
I'm Nick. But Paul is going to run the presentation. I'm doing this from my phone, so I can't change the slides.
I just
So
want to
can you
say
make-
really quickly before we get into this, you guys, that we've had a lot of people work on this one over the years. Patrick Kennedy, who I believe is here to answer some questions, has done a lot of the legwork on this one. and he deserves a big shout out, and he might have to answer some of the questions, but you're in very capable hands with Nick and Paula as well.
Thanks, Ted. What's the key? Is it Control L makes it go full screen, or Apple L?
And I might just add that this is a really pleasant surprise. We didn't know about this until, I guess, about a week ago, and it's fantastic that you're coming to us. So thank you.
Great. Well, thanks for having us. Again, my name is Nick Carey from the DOT Bike Unit to talk about the last gap on 2nd Avenue bike lane between 43rd and 34th Streets. So it's a little bit of the outline of the presentation. We're going to do a little bit of background, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the temporary lanes we installed with barrels, and then we'll get into our proposal. Could we go to slide 4, please?
I'm sorry, can you see slide 4?
No, we're still looking at least on my screen, I see the first slide and the PDF view.
Okay, I am in slide 4. I am not really sure what's happening.
Do you want to try to stop sharing and share again?
Yeah.
Oh, we just saw slide 2. It's 2.
Okay, can you see slide 4?
Nope.
Yep.
I am not sure what's happening.
Do you want to the board office? They may be able to.
I can certainly send you the presentation.
Yeah, I send it to info, INFO at CBSIX,
Oh.
CB like community board, SIX, the number spelled out, .org.
When we receive it, we can try and display the slides. We will just need cues as to when to advance slides, but DOT can provide us with that.
Will do. Thanks.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the address again, the email?
Sure, info, INFO at CBSIX.org. CB like community board, SIX like the number 6.org.
Okay, it was just sent.
Thank you.
Okay, so we should receive it in the next minute or so.
Back through some of the background since folks are generally familiar with the corridor and the project. If you want.
Yeah, I'll just talk about it a little bit because some of this stuff I don't think you really need the slide. So the crash history, if you were to see our glorious slide for the 2nd Avenue crash statistics, basically what it shows is that 2nd Avenue is a Division 0 priority corridor. and that 2nd Avenue and 42nd Street and 2nd Avenue and 34th Street are both Vision Zero priority intersections. And what that means is when we look at pedestrian crashes, specifically pedestrian crashes that result in serious injury or fatality, this corridor sticks out and these intersections stick out as hotspots. And one of our best tools for improving pedestrian safety on wide streets like 2nd Avenue is protected bike lanes. All right, we're up and running. Can we go to slide 5, please? All right, so CB6 is a pretty savvy board. I don't really need to tell you guys that a lot of people are biking on 2nd Avenue, but what is interesting is that biking has really been booming during the pandemic, and more people are biking than ever before. We did a rough calculation, kind of back of the envelope, looking at city bike counts and our own automated counts throughout the city, and weekday cycling is up about 20% and weekend is up about 60%. So there's a lot of people biking. Next slide, please. And one more. So let's talk about the bike network on the east side. So I'm not sure how many of you realize this, but this project is a very exciting milestone for the bike network on the east side. There is a nearly continuous protected bike lane from the Manhattan Bridge to the Willis Avenue Bridge via 1st and 2nd Avenues and Allen and Christie Streets. This is the last gap, this section of 2nd Avenue between 43rd and 34th Street, the last major gap. So if we implement this project, we'll close that gap and people can ride a bike in a continuous protected bike lane from Willis Avenue in the Bronx all the way to J Street in downtown Brooklyn. Next slide, please. Now, last year, we installed a protected bike lane on what was then the other big gap, which is 2nd Avenue between 68th and 59th Streets. So the photos here highlight our work at 2nd Avenue and 59th Street in front of the Queensboro Bridge. Just to give you guys a brief update on our work here, generally it's been working well, we think. Cyclists are using the Pork Chop Island and this 3-stage crossing to safely get past the bridge. We still want to install a crosswalk across the bridge entrance along the east side of 2nd Avenue, but much of this land is technically part of the bridge structure. And so in order to install proper pedestrian ramps and new signal infrastructure, we're likely going to have to initiate a capital project. But just know for now that this is something we are still working on. Next slide, please. And one more, please. So the COVID-19 response, temporary bike lane. So during the pandemic, many cities across the country and across the world have been experimenting with installing bike lanes using temporary materials like barrels. Olgun was talking about this a little bit in the last presentation. And we have been doing this also in New York with varying levels of success. We installed barrels on 2nd Avenue, I believe in March. And it's been, like Olgun said, it's been a very labor-intensive process for us. Anybody can go and move those barrels. So we constantly have to monitor it and go back and fix them, especially challenging near the Queens Midtown Tunnel. But we're here tonight presenting this proposal in the hope that we can install real bike lanes in their place as soon as possible with roadway markings and signage and bollards and signal infrastructure. Next slide, please. And then one more. So let's talk about the proposal. Actually, first let's talk about the existing conditions. So right now on 2nd Avenue, between 43rd and 34th Streets, there's no dedicated space for people riding bikes. There's shared lane markings on the street, and people biking are expected to share the lane with dense vehicular traffic. There are particularly large vehicular conflicts with people walking and biking at the left turns onto 42nd Street, 34th Street, and especially the Queens Midtown Tunnel entrance at 36th Street. Next slide, please. So here's our proposal. Now, this is nothing new for you guys. It's the same as what we installed last year between 68th and 59th Streets. It's also the same as what we installed in 2017 between 59th and 43rd Streets. The basic idea is we install a green bike lane along the east curb, and then the adjacent lane functions as a travel lane during the peak period and a loading lane off-peak. So during the periods with peak vehicular volume, we maintain all existing travel lanes, ban loading from the east curb, and people riding bikes get to ride in a curbside dedicated bike lane. Off-peak, when vehicle volumes are lower, we allow loading in the floating parking lane, and people can ride bikes in a parking protected lane. So in the next slide, you'll see photos of similar conditions. On the left, you can see the peak period design where it's just a sort of a curbside bike lane with no parked cars. And then on the right, you can see what happens when loading is allowed and it becomes a parking protected lane. All right, next slide, please. So now into making it work, the harder part. One more, please. So this is the Queens Midtown Tunnel entrance. This is an aerial photograph showing 2nd Avenue and 36th Street. This is basically the crux of the project. It's a very complex intersection. There's a lot of congestion leading into the tunnel. There's no dedicated space for cyclists. And it's tough for pedestrians too, because it's a very long crosswalk on the east side. And there's a very high volume double left turn going into the tunnel. And pedestrians are crossing the tunnel entrance at the same time as vehicles are making the left turn from 2nd Avenue into the tunnel. So it's really not ideal. It's not a very inviting space. Another unusual component to this intersection is the unsignalized slip lane for vehicles entering the tunnel from 2nd Avenue. All right, next slide, please. So here's our proposal for the entrance to the Queens Midtown Tunnel. 1, we install a buffered bike lane along the east curb. 2, close the unsignalized slip lane into the tunnel, which is currently only open sometimes, but we want to close it so that cars aren't darting across the crosswalk and bike lane at high speed. 3, we want to change the signal phasing to a split phase, which means that people riding bikes and people walking on the east crosswalk will have a protected signal phase that is completely separated from the vehicular turn phase. And I know signal timing is kind of a boring subject, but it's important that you understand the distinction here because right now, that heavy turn from 2nd Avenue happens at the same time as pedestrians crossing in the east crosswalk. And fully separating these movements will be a huge safety improvement and quality of life improvement, frankly. And let me tell you, as an engineer, from an engineer's perspective, and from a bureaucrat's perspective, making operational changes to such a congested intersection is not something we take lightly. Because it's already so congested entering the tunnel, we certainly don't want to make it worse. We don't want the queues to stretch even longer and make life harder for more people. It's a really sticky problem. And I think that's part of why it's the last gap in the 2nd Avenue bike lane network. But there are a couple of things that help to convince us to move forward with the proposal. The first thing is that idea that a vehicular conflict of this magnitude just has to be mitigated. Congested or not, it's a safety hazard, and not just for people biking, but for people walking too, and we have an obligation to mitigate it. The second thing that convinced us that we should move forward with the proposal is the realization that the reason for the congestion, or the pinch point that's causing the congestion, is actually downstream at the tunnel entrance where all the lanes merge. Now, I don't know how often you guys drive to Queens, but there's only 2 lanes in the tunnel. That's it, just two lanes. And you have 2 lanes leading in from 2nd Avenue, 2 lanes feeding in from 36th Street, and another lane of traffic coming in from, what is it called? Tunnel Approach Street off of 34th Street. And all that traffic has to merge down to 2 lanes at the entrance to the tunnel. And that's the reason why it's so backed up. It's not that there isn't enough green time for everybody. It's all that merging. So that's how we realized that closing the unsignalized slip lane and installing a dedicated bicycle and pedestrian phase wouldn't have a significant impact on vehicular travel times or queue lengths. Because the real problem is beyond the signal at the lane merge. But to be clear, we may see slightly longer queues at the peak travel times for vehicles entering the tunnel from 2nd Avenue. But we feel that this is more than worth it. I cannot understate the safety benefits of separating vehicular traffic from the walking and biking phase. So that was a lot of talking about one intersection. But I want you guys to understand that it's not a change we take lightly, but we feel that it's the right thing to do. All right, next slide, please. So a couple other operational changes I'd like to mention. First, we also want to install split faces for the left turns from 2nd Avenue onto 42nd Street and onto 34th Street. Both of these intersections are Vision Zero priority intersections. They both have heavy left turn volume. So similar to 36th Street, we want to install protected turn faces so that people biking on 2nd Avenue and people walking in the east crosswalk can cross 42nd Street and 34th Street without any vehicular conflicts. The last thing I want to point out in our plan is the block on 2nd Avenue between 43rd and 42nd Streets. And this is the block where the Israeli consulate is located on the east side of the street, and the police department sets up metal barricades next to the east curb. To accommodate this, we altered our design a little bit so that there's a 3-foot wide painted buffer between the bike lane and the curb. So that way the police department can continue to set up the metal barriers without impacting the bike lane. All right, on to the summary of benefits. Let's do this, guys. Let's improve safety. Let's improve access for people crossing the Midtown Tunnel, the Queens Midtown Tunnel. Let's improve safety at 42nd and 34th Streets, which are Vision Zero priority intersections. And let's close the gap in the 2nd Avenue protected bike lane. This is it. It's 2020. Let's do it. That's it. Are there any questions?
And sorry, I will direct, I have a couple questions myself. One, the 42nd to 43rd, we had a presentation by, I guess it was the Ford Foundation, that they're actually they're planning on implementing a new bollard system there, which may actually alleviate some of these problems. So I'm not sure if they are moving forward with it, but it did seem very hopeful that they wouldn't be blocking the street anymore, that they would be setting up something on the sidewalk. So that's just maybe something that it's worth reaching out or getting some coordination with them.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. And I don't know, we have lots of questions, but okay, Anne, you're first.
Okay, so I also was gonna say something about coordinating with the Ford Foundation and the changes that they are making there. I love the idea of having the bike lane offset, so something can be done, because we know that's a high danger intersection. But I think you all need to talk to each other, and if this is the plan you go with, make sure the PD doesn't just, set the blocks so they're just perpendicular to the sidewalk and block the bike lane too, which is certainly not impossible.
Nope.
I'm just saying. The other thing I would say, one other thing, is you are talking transportation geeks. We love hearing about signal timing. I suspect most people here would say that. Because we are transportation geeks, I want to make sure that I was understanding you correctly when you were talking about peak hours rather than rush hours. Because in the area, kind of East Midtown, Turtle Bay area, rush hours, what most people think of as rush hour, is not peak hour. So I just want to make sure I'm understanding the way you are using those terms.
Absolutely. Rush hour is kind of a funny term in New York. It doesn't really apply. It's more like rush, period. I think the idea is that we would be using the same parking regulations we have further north on 2nd Avenue. Somebody can jump in to tell me
For
I'm
the
wrong.
43rd to 56th
Yeah,
Street.
it's like no standing, 7 to 10, 3 to 8, something like that. We would use the same thing. So it's definitely not an hour. It's a big chunk of time.
No, but it's also actually not peak time. Those are the peak times. When we heard about this for the northern stretch, those were the peak times. The rush hours are not our peak hours. And honestly, it's worked very well, I think, in that area. So that's fine. But I think, especially if you say peak hours, you should be talking about peak hours. And I think you're not.
Okay, that's a good point.
I can chime in here. It's really a question of keeping the regs simple and, you know, using the same regs throughout. It is like from a historical perspective, those are generally peak hours. And I think
But
that's
they're
what
not in this
Nick was talking
neighborhood.
about.
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
But we're
Okay.
going to keep the hours that we have, right? So that's
Right.
basically they're working well now, so we keep them.
Exactly.
Exactly.
So it's consistent, and so it's consistent for that whole stretch as well.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Matt, you had your, sorry, Anne, did you have anything else? We just got a lot of questions. I'm trying to keep us.
Nope, that's it.
Thank you. Matt, you had your hand raised?
Yeah, a couple things. So going back to the Queens Midtown Tunnel intersection, just want to point out that horn honking has been a major complaint throughout the community at the Queens Midtown Tunnel during peak hours, which also go late into the night sometimes. So anything that would potentially exacerbate the queues getting into the tunnel should be looked at carefully. And number two, what's happening with the 35th Street area with the construction, which is slated to continue through 2022 and possibly even later? How is that being reflected in this?
We're going to have to work around it. We've been getting better in recent years about putting in temporary bike lanes through construction zones. But that construction you're talking about does predate this proposal. So we'll have to work with our permitting units and with the contractor to see that we can get around the construction.
And that has definitely been one of the challenges to moving this project forward. But I think once we have the temporary lane in place and are seeing it used and support from your board and all that, we do want to try to move this forward in the shorter term, working with it.
Actually, that brought up one issue. We're wondering, the pavement is extremely rough in that area because of the construction. Will that be part of what you do when you implement this change? Is repave that area?
What?
It's possible. I can't speak to it right now because I'm not sure what the schedule is. It could be that, you know, that as part of the stipulations for the construction permits, they have to repave it. But I can't speak to that now, but that's something we can look into.
Yeah, it would be really helpful. It's extremely rough. And I just, to Matt's point, a lot of the honking had to do with the work around the tunnel. So there was a disruption in patterns. So hopefully this is not quite the same condition. Andrew, you had your hand up?
Sandra, thanks. Actually, first of all, I'm glad that Matt raised the construction issue. That's really insane what's been going on over there. So I just second that. I just want to say, as clearly from my previous comment, the last discussion, you know, I drive a car with some frequency, and I've driven through that tunnel many times, and maybe one of the few people in this group that has done so with any regularity. So just from someone who I always 99% of the time support all the bicycle work that we do. I think it's great. I think that this proposal is really good. I think that you guys did an excellent job of finding a solution because that intersection, trying to navigate it, even in a car in its current condition, is just horrific and extremely confusing. And I think that one of the points that really didn't come up is that slip lane that you guys showed when you're approaching it now, it's actually just confusing. I think a lot of people just don't know what to do in their car when they get there, and that adds to the issues. So I think you really mitigated that. I would only ask that you, after you implement this, to really carefully watch the intersection for any traffic buildup that may occur from the changing of the timing, and just be ready to mitigate that. It sounds like you guys have a pretty good handle on it. That's really my only concern. So thanks again.
Thank you.
And Larry, you had your hand raised?
Yes. Thank you, Ted, Patrick, and Nick. This is something that I am very, very grateful for. and have been looking forward to learning about for a very long time. As you know, I've asked many questions at many meetings. I think you've done a excellent job, really an excellent job. I do have an old question that relates to the rush hour treatments of having the traffic moving adjacent to the bicycle lane. Have you any thoughts about improving the protection of cyclists while being adjacent to the moving cars? Any of the older solutions that we mentioned being revisited, such as delineator bollards or tough curbs?
Absolutely. Oh, go ahead, Ted.
Sorry, I was just going to chime in that, it's something that I don't remember when we did Second Avenue originally. I guess it was the original rush hour lane was probably 3 years ago, maybe even 4. And this is something that's, as we work more in Midtown, the spaces get tighter and tighter. And we are looking for materials, but the reality still exists that the way the infrastructure works to have sweepers, we just don't have the sweeping capabilities. Now, that said, I think through a lot of those conversations, sweeping and plowing, through a lot of those conversations, I will say, honestly, that I think that dialogue is really changing with DSNY sanitation, and they are starting to look at smaller vehicles. It's coming up a lot more. People are starting to tweet photos of other cities and their equipment. And I do think it's moving in a positive direction. The simple answer to your question is no, we don't have that solved yet. But the more nuanced answer is we're working on it, and it is something that we spend a good deal of time on. I'm afraid to say that I think the COVID situation right now with budget is probably going to put a lot of those conversations a little bit on hold. I want to maybe I could turn that frown upside down, and I could say that, hey, maybe in the future, this might change things a little bit with the way that they want to do things at DSNY. But yeah, that's pretty much my take. Sorry, I don't have a better answer than that.
Okay, just to follow up, considering the priority of this life-saving project, do you have an ETA that you're working on?
That I wouldn't say right now. I'm having a hard enough time with the ETA of projects in general right now. But I think all the work that you guys do to bring it up and continue to talk about it, I think it does help a little bit. And I think we're going to get there. It would just be a guess, so I don't want to guess.
Thank you again.
But we hope this year.
And
wait, are you talking about the project? I thought you were talking about
the project. When are you going to implement this? When we pass
it. Nick had the right answer, so he's going to speak.
Yeah, definitely this year. I don't know if we want to get into the details of the schedule, Ted. Probably not. There's a lot of unknowns for us right now. We're using contractors to install markings, and everything is tough. Everything's up in the air with COVID. But this is definitely a high priority for us.
And I would say also that's one of the reasons why we wanted to come to you guys so quickly, and we kind of bumped this up because we do want to, if we have the opportunity in the schedule, we want to move on it. And the sooner we work with you guys, the faster we can work.
And we have a couple more questions, but actually, if I could just segue, that was one of the questions that people in some of the public had, is when is it going to be implemented? And if we can't implement it tomorrow, could we do something about the temporary barrels that are there now, because they keep getting shifted and it's not very safe in its current condition? If there was something maybe a little more stable. I don't know if that's something that can be done if you don't start work tomorrow.
In fact, I'm sorry, if I could just add to Sandy's note, various members of CB6 have been moving those barrels back into place because they've been moved so consistently. So the question is kind of pressing to us.
Yeah.
We appreciate that.
We asked NYPD if they would take care of it. They said no. MTA won't take care of it. They said it's really totally up to DOT.
So I think it's a very fair point, and I think that's why, as Ted mentioned, we did want to come to you with this presentation now and be on track to move it forward as soon as we can, understanding that it's not ideal, obviously, to have the barrel situation happen, but that's what we have for now. We have been, as they mentioned, coming back and moving barrels and trying to keep things in order, but it's not a perfect system by far.
The staff, our staff is like overworked moving barrels on these things. So I'm very weary to say that we can do more, but we definitely flag it and we try so hard. They literally, like Eileen is, she's managing a whole crew on 38th and 39th, which is in much worse conditions than this. So I think we'll try. I can say we'll give it the good old college try.
Great, thank you. And I mean, I think anybody in our district who sees the barrels moved, will go out and help to implement them. Brian, I know you have your hand raised. We did have 2 other questions from the public. I'm hoping you're going to call the question, Brian. Is that why you have your hand raised? Or?
No, I really have a substantive question.
Okay, go ahead.
You, in regards to this plan, and thank you for this plan, it looks to me like a very satisfactory plan. In regards to the issues of the lane reconfigurations and closing the slip lanes and all this, do you have buy-in from MTA at this point? Would you be able to proceed with them, or do you still have to negotiate with them on some of these changes?
We've been in communication with MTA about it. They're aware of our plans. Since this is technically our jurisdiction and not theirs, I don't know how to put this nicely. We don't have to get their permission to make changes on city streets. But we're definitely working with them and with the police department as well, because they have staff out there all the time to make sure everything's coordinated and everybody's familiar.
Great, thank you. And
if I could, just 1 second before you go to the public, I just wanted to thank Ted and Patrick and Nick, because we all know how long we've been pushing to get this thing closed. And as Larry said, as other people have said, it's like, okay, finally, at least it's within sight. So my follow-up question real quick is just if the construction site isn't going to be finished until 2022, that means we're going to have to be living with the barrels as a temporary thing until then, or is there some compromise? This is why I'm asking. I'd like to have that spelled out just a little bit more if you can.
I think,
go ahead, Kim.
I think the answer is that we're working to get this in. We have to work obviously with the MTP, the Maintenance and Protection of Traffic, MPT, at that location, and with our OCMC permitting people and with everyone else. So we don't have an exact answer at this point, but know that we're working to get it in as quickly as we can. And we don't intend to leave barrels out there for 2 years.
Thank you.
And I just want to make sure that you guys are also giving credit to Paula, who has been working very hard on 2nd Avenue for many years as well.
Didn't mean to leave anybody out.
And so I'll just read, we do have a couple questions. There's a gap on 1st Avenue approaching 42nd Street where bikes are in the middle lane between 2 cars. That's scary. Can this be fixed also, please? And just to let them know that we have discussed this in our committee. And part of the concern we had is that there's a detour right now and it's an unusual condition. We're trying to get Tudor City to take down the scaffolding, but we have actually discussed this in committee. So it hasn't, it's maybe not specific to tonight's discussion, but to let you know, we are talking about it. We answered about the impact attenuators instead of barrels. I realize this may be a heretical question, but wouldn't it be safer to replace the double left turn lane to the tunnel with a single left turn lane?
The single left, well, the thing is, they're going to have a dedicated signal phase. So whether it's 1 lane or 2 lanes or 3 lanes, it doesn't make any difference. They're all going to go while pedestrians and cyclists are held. And a double turn lane will process it faster, which gives more time for pedestrians to cross, more time for bicyclists to go. And it also moves more traffic out of the way. So it means we'll have a shorter queue. One thing I've always kind of struggled to explain, but you guys, I think, kind of nailed it, is the quality of life implications of extreme traffic. The honking, the blocking the box, all that stuff. So I don't want to, stand up here like I'm some representative of the auto lobby, but we do have to strike a balance between, ensuring safety and protected signal phases and making sure that life is not a living hell for the local residents. But in general, a double turn, just a permitted double turn, we don't like. And that's what exists there today, and we hate it. So, and the same thing is happening at 34th Street. So we feel like double turns should always have separate signal phases from crossing pedestrians and cyclists.
Next question, why can't DOT use something other than barrels for construction protection? The way, how you go about protecting construction, they use something other than barrels.
I assume we're talking about the barrels that are out there right now for the temporary lane.
Yes, and even the construction that's ongoing that we may have to deal with after, as this moves forward.
The thing with the barrel protected lanes is that if we could install protected bike lanes just with barrels and without any markings, without signal infrastructure, and they worked well, then we would have been doing that this whole time. The only reason we're doing it now is because we have such a hard time. There's such a hard time getting resources allocated and getting contractors out in the field, and a lot of things have kind of broken down in the short term. So I wish they worked better, but it's kind of not surprising that they don't function as well as the real thing. But for barrels at construction sites, I don't know. That's beyond my specialty. I think
they use like Jersey barriers and some other things that are a little more robust.
The other thing they use are those plastic Yodocs, they're called, where they fill them up with water. And it works a little bit better. The problem is we don't have access to a lot of those right now, and they take up a lot of storage, and we're trying to react fast on very large purchases for this stuff. So that will definitely be possible for construction with contractors in the future. We've gotten a lot better on MPTs, which is the maintenance protection of traffic around construction sites. But as far as this is part of the reason why we're moving forward so fast on this, or we're trying to, is we don't like the barrels either, to tell you the truth. They're subpar. So we want to get the lane in there.
And just quickly, we had a question about buffers between the rush hour traffic lane and the cyclists. That was the same question that Larry had. Can you explain the risk to getting this project completed in 2020?
I'm sorry, the risk?
Yes, what things do we have to overcome to get it done this year?
It's an interesting question.
I'll take a shot at it. I'll take a shot at it.
Okay.
That's really hard to say because we're dealing with a lot of contractors and we're dealing with a marking season that is very condensed given what happened during COVID. It's pretty much a matter of getting manpower out on the street and making sure that the myriad of forces behind a markings contractor is in place. So that's not an easy question, but we're working very hard on trying to get those systems up and running.
Okay, great. And we are running short of time. Oh, B, you had a question, sorry.
Actually, I didn't have a question. I wanted to thank them for what they have done during this very difficult time. And the fact that you made the presentation today is pretty amazing. And I just wanted to know if we wanted to call the question and show our support so we can move forward.
Yes, please. All right, so Jesus.
Second.
Is that a motion?
Yes, it is.
Yes, second, yes.
Second.
right. Question has been called on a resolution for Second Avenue Bike Lane. I'll call your name. You may vote in favor,
Yes.
against, abstain, or not entitled. Sandy, were you gonna say something?
I'm gonna,
Okay. Sandy McKee votes in favor. Jean Santoro?
4.
All right, thank you. Joan Berenbaum? Joan Berenbaum? Okay. Did we hear anything from Joan? I don't. Folks, I can't see you because I'm on a vote tally screen.
4.
Oh, thank you. Claire Brennan?
Abstain for cause.
B. Disman?
4.
Thank you. Andrew Gross?
4.
Thank you. Molly Hollister?
In support?
Thank you. Yusuf Khalid?
4.
Thank you. Phil Napolitano?
4.
Thank you. Matt Roberts?
Favor.
Thank you. Larry Shire?
4.
Thank you. Ann Seligman?
4.
Thank you. Brian Van Nieuwenhoven?
In favor.
Thanks. Ronnie White? Ronnie White? Bob Cohen? Bob Cohen? James Wilson? James Wilson? Ray Knowles? Ray Knowles. All right, that is 12 in favor, 1 abstention for cause. The motion passes.
sorry, thank you so much. And Jean Santoro is going to write the resolution for us. And I'm sorry, Brendan, but our next agenda item, could you remind me of that, please? Sorry.
It's an update from the New York City Department of Transportation on the Open Streets program and proposals to use city streets for outdoor dining.
And maybe we can send this information out to everybody. It seems to be hopefully it's very successful. We did have one question. Our board passed a resolution about 50th to 51st Street, looking at that as kind of a pilot project where we might close additional lanes on an avenue. Has there been any feedback to that proposal?
I think at this point, it's obviously, I mean, we've just talked about all the challenges with Second Avenue and with shutting down traffic. So at this point, we're not looking, not strongly considering those types of proposals. We're working through a lot of issues with enforcement and a lot of education issues and trying to get the pieces that we have out there functioning properly. I think it's really challenging for us to address Second Avenue in that way.
And just during the evenings, there's no traffic on Second Avenue. It's actually been quite an amazing change. Mm-hmm. We had presentations from the restaurateurs who are really suffering. So it's been quite a substantial change in traffic patterns. And we realize this is only until October. Mm-hmm. So we're
the roadway stuff is actually only until Labor Day. At this point, it's a pilot project. And I think we can, it's something that obviously we've had our attention drawn there and it's on our list of requests that we've received. But like I said, we are dealing with a lot of requests, I guess, and working through how to get things that are out there right now functioning properly. And we did launch our Open Streets with Open Restaurants last week. And so that does allow some streets to be closed for Friday nights, Saturdays, and Sundays. So I think what you're looking at is something more along those lines. At this point, we're looking at full closures of generally smaller streets. But it is on our radar. But I think at this point, it's not something that we have a plan for. would say.
So, you know, hopefully something could evolve for that. But thank you for considering. We just hope it's something that could work out.
I understand, and believe me, like we've heard a lot from restaurants, and it's hard because we want to be able to help as many as we can, and so we really are trying to be flexible and adapt even our guidelines as we go to try to work with everyone. But at this point, we haven't gotten to that level of change yet.
It's made a fantastic change to Second Avenue to see people sitting out on Second Avenue in restaurants. It's wonderful. So whatever you can do would be appreciated. I think, sorry, Jesus, next item.
The next item on the agenda is a discussion of resolution requesting the DOT assess converting some commercial metered parking spaces to general metered parking in Community District 6.
Okay. And this was a resolution that Andrew actually very kindly, very quickly put together to address some of the commercial spaces, I guess, in his area. And it's here before you. And I know the last time we brought this up, there was concern that we really needed to discuss it as a group instead of having a very fast just pass through. And I think there was, I think, Anne, you had some comments you wanted to make.
I do. I can start at either the general or the specific. But I'll start at the general. And I think my biggest issue is I'm not exactly sure who we think would use these spaces. If we converted some local commercial spaces, and honestly, I mean, I'm all in favor of having DOT, despite what they just said about how, you know, sort of run ragged they are. I'm all in favor of having this investigated. But I'm not sure who would use these spaces. As far as I can tell, there are essentially no alternate side parking spaces in Midtown. And I did a little research on this. I used my Best Parking app to look, and there's like a few blocks here and there that have some, but basically I think if you own a car between 29th Street and 58th Street, and I am one of those people that does, you cannot use alternate side parking. And so I'm not sure who this is going to help. So we're not really a shopping destination. So, and I'm not sure we want to encourage non-residents coming and parking. Like if what we're talking about doing is converting commercial parking spaces that is like 2-hour meter spacing, which is what we have mostly here, to convert that to 2-hour like non-commercial, I'm not sure who's going to use that. And if it's people coming from other places that are driving here and looking for parking, I'm not sure we want to encourage that. So that's kind of one general comment that I'd really like to understand. I have a lot of kind of specific issues that we can come back to. The other general point I will say is everywhere in this resolution where it says commercial parking, we should really think about diplomatic parking, because personal observation, totally anecdotal, those are the spaces that are empty, are the diplomatic spaces, not the commercial spaces. So Sandy, I'll leave it there, and you can come back to me on kind of specifics after other people have had a say. Oh, actually, there is one other general point. Let me say it before I remute myself. My kind of understanding of how those commercial spaces are used is that they are vehicles that are using those commercial spaces to service to service residential buildings. So there are people that are using, Spectrum, delivery people, plumbers, and, boiler repair people. And so again, my question is like, I'm not really sure who would use those spaces. And now I'll shut up.
B, you have your hand up?
I was looking at the resolution and a couple of comments. I don't know what the end goal is, of the study. I don't know if in writing of it, there was something in our mind, Andrew, about whether we were looking to convert 10%, 15%. I share some of Anne's comments as to, I don't know who exactly would take those places, but this is so generalized that I don't know what our end goal is. And I was wondering if you had any, I know we're asking to look at it, but did you have any goals in mind when you were presenting this?
Sandy, can I respond to?
Yes, please. Yeah. Sorry, go right ahead.
Actually, yeah, that's a great question. To Anne's point, actually, Anne and I live in the same building, and Anne said who would use the spaces, and it's actually the people who work in our building asked me to do that. The people who work in the building, who are the doormen, who are the super, actually these guys asked me. So, and that's who asked, originally came up with this idea. And so, my perspective is, we're on the board, we represent obviously the interests of this area. And there's a lot of people who are working, coming in all the time, to work, and, they're coming from faraway places to do jobs that, we need done. And not all of them have access to public transit so easily where they're coming from and do these jobs. And what they basically said is, look, they're out in the street all day. They see there's a lot of commercial spaces, at least in our block and other blocks nearby, that just aren't utilized. And when I posed this to DOT, initially their point was, look, these areas were marked for commercial parking, likely in an era where there was a very different zoning situation here, where there was more retail or more restaurants or whatever. It was just zoned, could have been zoned 20, 30 years ago, or these signs could have been assigned that long ago. So basically the reason that this is so general is actually just to ask DOT, look, take a look at the parking situation. See if there are any spaces that are underutilized for commercial that could just be flipped to be regular metered spots that people don't have to put their car in an expensive garage all the time. If DOT says, hey, you know what, like these spots are totally utilized by commercial or needed by commercial, whatever businesses, then no need. But if they see that they really are underutilized, then why not let the public, take advantage and not have to, make people put their car in the private lots if they're available. That was the thought process behind this.
Sorry, Larry, you had a question?
I want to address my question to Andrew. And Andrew, you can unmute yourself and talk back and forth. Thank you. So I'm trying to understand how the folks that asked you for these spaces intend to use these spaces, or how long a period would they require the space?
Well, some of them could be for like multiple hours or all day or during their shift, right? They could always, go on their shift or take a break and move the car. I really don't know exactly how long. I think it's sort of, Larry, I'm looking at this from a very generalist perspective, which is simply like, I'm not asking them, I didn't go to them and say, how long do you need the spot? Or or, you know, what's your intention? It's simply, you know, if there's underutilized commercial space, let's let people park if they want to park there, instead of leaving them just like empty spots. And to all of our bike friends, there's no bike lanes here. I'm not suggesting, you know, changing the parking system. It's just, if it's empty, let's let people use it.
Okay, I do have a great concern about subsidizing on-street parking. And I know you're saying that you want to give a bargain for folks who don't want to pay to park in a commercial garage. I'm a bit concerned about the policy implication of trying to add to, without a real specific goal in mind as to what the purpose of these spaces would be, to generally add to the number of people driving into Manhattan for
Larry, it's not,
maybe.
It's not adding to that. Just to be clear, you're not adding in the number of people driving in. You're just, people are already coming. It's just to let them, if there's an empty space, let them park.
Well, you disincentivize people by making it difficult or expensive, and then they choose when they should travel and maybe travel only on the important trips.
You're disincentivizing work. Like, this is, again, I'm just saying, this is coming from like workmen. It's not coming from like shoppers.
Okay, I just wanted to engage you in the discussion. Thank you.
No problem.
Brian, you had a question?
Unmuting. I mean, I just wanted to comment that given the concern that Andrew raised with the doormen in his building, you know, a lot of the concerns that we issue are both district concerns and individual concerns. And I think the issue with talking about personal vehicle parking so intensely is that I'm not sure that with these examples, it ever raises beyond the point of an individual concern, and even then not a need. I think that the way that this city works is that we need a functioning mass transit system and that people need to use it. It is impossible for a city of our density to accommodate equitable parking for everybody, especially even with the use of private lots. It's just not workable. So every time we go down this path, what we're doing is we're basically creating a perk for 5% of the people to drive into Midtown and to create all these negative externalities for the rest of us while leaving 95% of the population out of coverage. If the workers in your buildings in East Midtown do not have the transit coverage that they need to commute within the city back and forth to work, then we as residents of the city need to advocate to the state to improve transit coverage to both the neighborhoods they live in and the neighborhoods that they work in. And if the transit coverage is sufficient and they just want to drive in anyway for their own convenience, it's not something that we should take up.
Sorry, Jean? You had a comment?
Sorry, yeah, I did. Sorry, I was distracted. You know, yeah, I think I was going to call the question. I think we've been over this. This is the second time around for this. And we took it to full board and they sent it back to us with some good reasons. The committee's questions tonight, I think, have made it pretty plain that there are some serious questions about why this reso even exists.
Actually, Gina did not go to full board.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I thought it had gone there. My mistake.
No, it hasn't.
Okay. Then I take back my comment, my stupid comment. But on the other hand, that part of the stupid comment, on the other hand, I will continue with the rest of my stupid comment, which goes like this. It's pretty clear from the questioning, I think, that the committee doesn't see the point of this. So I'd like to call the question so we can take a vote on it and find out what we're going to do with it.
I agree. It's
wait,
getting very late.
Can I just say something really quickly?
2 seconds.
Okay.
5 seconds. First of all, Walter is parking across the street in the commercial space, has not been ticketed or towed. He
should be. He should be.
You know what? No, he has a letter saying he's an essential worker. He is in his 60s. I am happy with him driving from Staten Island. That's fine. He's paying the tolls. He's parking commercial parking. That's fine. I do not have a problem with exploring with DOT, if they have the bandwidth, exploring the question of commercial, like the balance of commercial, and if we can add diplomatic parking. You know, the resolve is that we convert a limited number. I will not vote for that, but I would vote for a resolution. I have some other changes here, which are kind of logical issues that, Andrew, I'd be happy to work with you on. But I would vote for, you know, having them assess the balance of commercial, residential, or commercial open. I don't even know what the term is. Commercial open and diplomatic parking. Because frankly, I think diplomatic parking is what gets left empty. So.
And if I could just remind everyone that we did just recently pass a reso where we asked the DOT to take a look at all of our street use. And this actually pretty much falls within it. We want to know
into that, yeah,
how to better use the space that we have in our streets. It's not time sensitive. If you, Andrew, if you and Anne want to tweak this some more, maybe we could come back to it in September.
Sure, I'd be happy.
You know what, Andrew, let's meet in the Pops on 46th and 2nd, which is now happily reopened, and we can talk about it.
I think that saying no problem, I think that Anne raised some ideas to modify it. And I think that what Anne said is actually in the spirit of what this is trying to do. So I have no problem sitting and looking at that with her.
Great. We'll make it more robust and kind of actually, you know, follow on with some of the other discussions we've had. That's great. I'm going to waive my report. It's almost 9 o'clock, but it's fantastic that we have now direction for 2nd Avenue. I'd like to, I think I have some text I'm supposed to say about how the meeting ends, but basically, if there are no objections, no old or new business. Oh, Andrew.
Have a great summer, everyone.
Wait, I have one new thing. Serious.
Oh, sorry.
Promise.
Okay, Andrew, go ahead.
I'm not sure if this is the right forum, but because it's the end and we're about to go into the summer, I think this is a transportation issue because we don't have a public safety committee.
Right.
So there are a lot of issues that are happening on our streets right now. There are a huge public safety issues happening with the safety of being on our streets. And so I'm deeply concerned. The violence is really, really getting out of control. And I think that in our next meeting, I would ask if maybe we could, if we're not going to have a public safety committee, to ask the NYPD to brief us on our street condition and what's going on in the safety of our streets.
And I might say there are still community council meetings to some degree. And so that's certainly something you can bring up with them. Matt actually has a very good connection with the 17th, that's your precinct. And I would definitely recommend reaching out, or Matt, maybe you can let Andrew know when the next meeting is going to happen so that you can participate. And we'll let everybody on the committee know as well. Is there anything scheduled?
That sounded like an invitation for them to come to our meeting.
Between now and September. I think it will be.
Or like in September.
Yes, absolutely. They can come in September, but we can also, I think there are ways to reach out to them in between. Okay, any other new or old business? Great, so we'll see you in September. Thank you.
Have a safe summer.
Yes, thank you so much. Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.